What will happen if a certain color is prohibited to the people of the country? Or would they treat urine as a valuable commodity? All these things may seem strange to you, but that wasn't the case for the Romans. In this video, we're going to look at some surprising facts about ancient Rome that wouldn't be accepted today by any chance. So, stay tuned and enjoy. Fathers were legally allowed to kill their families. Rome has always been a patriarchal society, but in the beginning, the Romans went too far. In the beginning of Rome, the members of the man's family were his property, and he could do as he pleased with them, which is why he sold his sons to slavery. It is up to him to punish his children. If he feels that his children deserve to die, then he can kill them without any legal repercussions. Even leaving home does not mean that his children are safe. A daughter can be killed by her father, even after she is married off and leaves the nest. Sons are never safe. They are not truly independent until they are sold 3 times or their father dies. Eventually, these rules were loosened. By the 1st century BC, a man's right to kill his family has been abolished for most of the time. However, if the son was found guilty of a felony, which would have sullied the family name, the father could still kill him. Rome's ultimate punishment. Your father didn't have to be the only one to kill you. The Romans came up with all sorts of inventive methods to punish criminals and prisoners, such as beheadings, being thrown from a great height, or being forced into gladiatorial shows and games. The worst kind of execution, however, was reserved for those found guilty of the ultimate crime, such as murder. First, they were blindfolded because they were no longer fit for the light. Then, they were marched out of the city and marched straight to the nearest big body of water, where they were beaten to the ground with rods until they bled to near death. Next, they were tied up and put into a big leather sack, along with snakes, dogs, monkeys, and roosters. The entire posse was thrown into the big pool of water. Either they drowned or were killed by the animals. They had confusing rules regarding adultery. It's no surprise that the Romans had different rules depending on whether you were caught cheating on your wife or your wife cheating on you. It's also no surprise that husbands were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted. They could have mistresses, sleep with prostitutes, and no one would have a problem with that. For his wife, it was different. When a husband caught his wife in the bedroom with another man, he was required to lock the door between the two lovers. Then the clock started ticking. He had 20 hours to get as many witnesses as possible to act as witnesses for him. Once he got those witnesses, he had another 3 days to get his evidence. He had to find out how long the affair lasted, where it happened, who the lover was, and all the other pertinent information he could find. Once he had all the facts, he had to divorce his wife. The Romans didn't believe in forgiveness, so if the husband didn't get a divorce from his wife, he could be accused of pimping out his wife. If he really wanted revenge, he could have killed his wife's lover, as long as they were slaves. If they were citizens, things got a bit more complicated. The husband would have to go to the father-in-law and get him involved. Because the father in Rome had a legal right to murder his daughter's lovers. Wearing purple was banned. We all know by now that, like many other societies, the Romans had a strong sense of class. But what many people don't realize is just how strong this sense of class was. For example, most free Romans were prohibited from wearing purple. Purple was seen as a color of glory, power, and royalty. Purple togas were only worn by the emperor and by other very high-ranking Romans. Why was purple color so much restricted? Because purple dye was incredibly expensive to produce. All of the purple dye in the Roman Empire came from Phoenicians. To produce enough purple dye for a single toga, 10,000 mollusks must be crushed. That means that for every pound of purple dye, the value of the dye would be about the same as the value of gold. The Romans also liked to distinguish a man's class simply by looking at him. The Romans had sumptuary laws, and a good example of this is the prohibition of purple togas. These laws were brought in to prevent lower-class Romans from displaying their wealth. Because in the Roman class system, wealth could only be flaunted by the upper classes. Prostitutes had to dye their hair blonde. This rule again has to do with class and social status. Most of the native-born Roman women had dark hair. Blonde hair was linked to the Gauls and the barbarians. Prostitution in ancient Rome was 100% legal. There were no social consequences for men who utilized their services. But the prostitutes themselves, especially the low-class ones, were looked down upon. So to ensure that no good, honest Roman woman would be mistaken for a prostitute, a law was passed that said that prostitutes, many of whom were slaves and had no choice in the matter, were to dye their hair blonde. The idea was that this would make them look more like the barbarian Gauls and less like the royal Roman ladies. Unfortunately for the lawmakers, the noble Roman women soon began to envy the sexy blonde hair. They either dyed their hair themselves or asked the poor prostitutes to shave their heads so they could make blonde wigs. They thought Christianity was a cannibalistic blood cult. Although the Romans were not the greatest of conquerors, they were also not the worst. For instance, they left the religious beliefs of the indigenous peoples relatively untouched. At best, they assimilated other people's religious beliefs into their own, which is why the Greek and Roman pantheons have so much in common. So why have the Romans had such a problem with the Jewish and early Christian faiths for such a long time? Partly the Romans were repelled by the practices of the Jewish and Christian faiths. The Romans were horrified by the practice of circumcision. The Romans had done some terrible things in the name of their gods, but this small bit of skin on the tip of their penis seemed a little too much for them. The Christians were initially seen as cannibals and blood cultists because the Romans did not understand the metaphor of the flesh of Jesus and blood of Christ and took the Holy Communion too seriously. Roman wrestling was fixed. Wrestling is a popular sport in many countries, and it's no surprise that it's also a popular sport in ancient Rome. One of the earliest known bribery contracts for sports dates back to AD 267 and is found in a papyrus found in Egypt. In it, a fighter agrees to throw a fight for 3,800 Roman drachmas, which is roughly the equivalent of a donkey. It's a small sum, but the wrestling competition on the Nile was going to be a great show, so there's no doubt other fighters made similar deals. Bribery in Roman sports was relatively common, but the penalty for it was severe. In fact, it's said that Zeus statues were built in Olympia using fines from athletes. The Greek philosopher Philostratus lamented the current state of athletics when he said, "Trainers do not care about the reputation of athletes, but become advisors on the buying and selling of the athletes for their own gain." Urine was a valuable commodity. The Romans used public toilets extensively. Not only were they places to relieve yourself, but they were important social hubs as well. These busy public toilets generated a large amount of waste. The Romans had to be creative in disposing of this waste. The Romans were great engineers, and most of the sewage of the citizens of Rome ended up in a system called the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewage systems. From this system, urine was collected, and the ammonia content of urine was used as a chemical for laundry and leather tanning. In addition to the public toilets, Roman dry cleaners, also called phelones, would go to the public toilets and collect urine themselves. The urine became such a lucrative commodity that the Romans began taxing urine as time went by. Roman public toilets were disturbing. The Romans are often thought of as clean people, and for the most part, this is true. However, this does not mean that Roman toilets would be considered clean by today's standards. Rome had more than 140 public communal toilets. These were not private toilets, but communal toilets where people would congregate while doing their business. Most of these communal toilets were connected through impressive sewage systems, which later societies would not be able to compete with for centuries. But the sad part is that there is a lot of evidence from archaeologists that these public toilets are biohazardous. The evidence suggests that these toilets were almost never cleaned. Archaeological evidence indicates that these toilets were infested with roundworms and fleas, as well as lice and cockroaches. These toilets predate toilet paper by several thousand years. Each public toilet contained a single tersorium, a solitary mushroom on a stick. This tersorium was used as a wipe after defecation. It was also never cleaned. Animals such as rats and snakes roamed the sewage system. There are records of people being bitten after spending too much time on the toilet. The toilets also produced large quantities of methane. Methane was known to build up under the toilets until it ignited and became surprisingly explosive. Some people even brought a statue of Fortuna, the Roman goddess of luck, with them when they went to the toilet. Ancient Rome struggled with air pollution. Using ice core testing in Greenland, climate scientists were able to trace methane levels in the atmosphere back hundreds of thousands of years. Methane levels were relatively low until about 100 BC, when they skyrocketed and stayed high until about AD 1600. The increase in methane coincided with the growth of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire was at its peak, its methane emissions were also at an all-time high. During this time, methane emissions around the world averaged about 31 million tons a year. That's 5 million tons less than the total emissions of the entire United States during the same period. To feed the Roman Empire, enormous amounts of livestock were needed, such as cattle, sheep, and goats. This, in addition to the growing population of the Roman Empire in the west, as well as the Chinese Empire in the east, contributed to the pollution during this time. Before we wrap up, if you would like to know about some of the most bizarre ancient practices people used to follow, click on this video. Thank you for watching the video. And if you like this video, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.